The transportation and ticket center at Disney is, to be quite honest, a massive inconvenience and one of the things that I hate most about Disney. And I love almost everything about Disney. And actually, Imagineers found it to be kind of an inconvenience themselves when they initially were forced to build it. Yes, forced to build it. But they quickly realized that instead of this being a problem, it actually could be an amazing opportunity. So let's dive into it. All things history and future of the transportation and ticket center. Welcome back to our channel. I am Mouselet2 from the Mouselets, and if you are new here, each Monday we post a deep dive on some of the coolest, most fascinating Disney topics. And if you've been here for a while, we've been posting about the Vacation Kingdom for a while, diving into all of the different pieces. The Lost Island, the Lost Water Park, the Lost Surfing Machine, the Lost Airport. Yes, many things from the Vacation Kingdom are still lost. And as I was planning this week's topic, I realized that I've kind of exhausted the Vacation Kingdom. And so I was reading through the Walt Disney World Master Plan, doing some research for my upcoming monorail video, and I realized that I was actually missing an incredibly critical piece of the Vacation Kingdom and actually of Walt Disney World as a whole. But it's one that most people find pretty boring. You don't think that there's much to it, but oh, you would be wrong, there is. And so that is when I decided to do a deep dive on the transportation and ticket center. If you don't know anything about the Vacation Kingdom, we have a full deep dive which gives a lot more context on it. But I'm just going to summarize it really briefly here. When Walt Disney World opened, there was only one theme park, and that was Magic Kingdom. And so Disney wanted guests to stay at their resort for more than one day. They wanted them to enjoy the on-site resorts, they wanted them to enjoy the golf courses and all of the other activities. And those activities were created actually for that very purpose. They added swimming, surfing, water skiing, archery, horseback riding, trails, golf, and so much more in an attempt to get people to stay on site for longer. And that really was called the Vacation Kingdom. And the Vacation Kingdom was phase one of that Walt Disney World master plan that they created in the 1960s. Phase two was a much larger expansion that was going to include eventually Epcot, the city of the future. It was going to include an industrial park where companies could showcase the most futuristic technologies. And it was going to include an airport of the future. And phase one was so important because it was really going to set the stage for what the Florida project could be. It was going to create the roadways that would interconnect everything, the transportation system of the monorail, and it also was going to create a place for people to park. Seemingly insignificant, but actually so important. So let's dive into what the master plan said about the transportation and ticket center. Guests visiting Walt Disney World will leave their automobiles either at a day visitor parking center located nearly 1 mile from the theme park entrance or at their hotel in case of vacationers staying in one of the themed resorts. From the parking center or their hotel, visitors will travel to the new theme park primarily by means of the elevated Walt Disney World Alweg monorail trains. By interconnecting the major areas, attractions, and accommodations of the Vacation Kingdom, the monorail serves a dual purpose. First, it provides a means of access to the theme park and hotels, and second, it will be an attraction in itself, an excursion tour introducing all the adventures awaiting the visitor in Walt Disney World. Well, guess what? That was not always the plan. I mean, Disney spun it really well in the master plan to make it seem like it always was the plan, but that wasn't always the plan. They actually wanted to put Magic Kingdom right where the Seven Seas Lagoon is today. Underneath that, yes, would be the parking lot, but then underneath that would be a large band of the different themed hotels. Well, unfortunately, they quickly realized that that was not possible. When they went out to do their initial site survey, I love putting on my civil engineering hat to talk about that, they realized that this land was just not suitable for building. That was things like the soil, all of the waterways. It just was not going to be a place that they could do what they wanted. And so they made some changes. They decided they're going to put Magic Kingdom north of that on a site of land that they weren't really planning on developing yet. And instead of having those resorts right below it, they would put them around a beautiful new lagoon for guests to actually experience more of the waterfront. And what this did was it meant it pushed that Magic Kingdom parking lot just south on the other side of the lagoon where the TTC is today. But this whole idea actually really worked with what they planned for the phase two expansion because remember, guests were going to be showing up to visit the city of the future, to visit the industrial park, and even for airport drop-off and things. And so they decided this would serve as their centralized parking area for everyone visiting Walt Disney World, excluding the people who are going to the Polynesian, the campground, and the contemporary resorts. And so the transportation and ticket center was born. And in many ways, this was a huge success because Imagineers really get to build up so much momentum for the excitement of seeing the castle for the first time. You board the monorail or the highway in the sky, as they called it. You'll pass through the contemporary, which was incredibly futuristic and honestly still is today. And as you arrive high up above Magic Kingdom, you get to see that amazing sight of the castle. And they've really effectively just rolled out this red carpet for you to enter their resort. So all of that was incredibly great. but it also had some major problems, and those problems still exist today. Because in the early days of the Walt Disney World Resort and Transportation and Ticket Center, there was only one singular way to get from the TTC to Magic Kingdom, and that was the monorail. Note that that description in the master plan, and even what I'm saying now, never mentions the ferries, because the ferries were not always planned. Yes, those were not always planned. They came out of this failure that I'm about to discuss. And so what was that failure? Well, the monorail was very exciting, but it had some massive space constraints. At the time, there were two different monorail tracks. There was the resort monorail track, and that had two monorails running around it. It took about 18 minutes total for a monorail to make a loop. They provided those two to make sure that resort guests could get to and from where they wanted to go. And then they had the express monorail. That was a little faster, about 8 or 9 minutes maybe going around the track, and they only had one of those. But 8 or 9 minutes, and how many people could actually fit on those monorails? Not that many. Because at the time, the Mark IV monorails generally had 5 cars, and those 5 cars had benches inside of them. But unfortunately for loading, those benches were the only place that people could actually sit on the monorail. There was no standing on the monorail at that time. Whether that's because of safety or they just wanted guests to have a better experience, I'm not sure, but you could not stand. And that meant that each monorail only had a capacity of around 210 people. But there were so many more people pouring into Walt Disney World. And so very quickly, Disney had to get creative. And when I say Disney, I'm really referring to the vice president of park operations at the time, which was Dick Nunes. You might remember his name if you've watched the abandoned surfing machine video. That was also his idea. But he realized we have to do something else because guests are waiting for far too long and there's not enough ways to get them. And so they did two things. First of all, they used pretty much any watercraft that was located on Disney property to get them back and forth across the lagoon. Again, remember, they did not have the ferries, but what they did have is a bunch of motorboats that guests could rent. They used those. They held about 6 to 10 people, and they would literally have cast members shuttling guests across the lagoon on those motorboats. They apparently used the Mike Fink keelboat. I can't find any evidence of that except on one blog, but I do find that's fascinating if they actually did that. And they also used the 2 Osceola-class sidewheeler steamships that were used for the Moonlight dinner cruises. And of course, they put in a purchase order for the ferries, but they weren't going to come for a bit. So they still had to do something else. And what they did actually was use parking lot trams. So they did have the parking lot trams running from the TTC lots up to the front of the Transportation and Ticket Center. They actually took about half of those, and those would run from the TTC to Magic Kingdom by World Drive. And World Drive is the road that connects the Transportation and Ticket Center area all the way up to Magic Kingdom, basically passing right by the Contemporary. And to put it simple, these trams did not work. They just were not meant for this. The parking lot trams have a really cool history in and of themselves, but basically they were similar to kind of what would pull like airplanes at the time. And while they were able to go up and down on some grades, like underneath that little bridge at the Transportation and Ticket Center, what they weren't able to do was go under the water bridge. The water bridge is the bridge of water that connects the Seven Seas Lagoon and Bay Lake. It's a pretty big hill, and the trams could not make it. So constantly, the trams were getting stuck under there. Guests would have to get off. It was basically a disaster. I found a really cool article written by Bob Gurr where he actually dives into how he designed the upgraded trams and all of the history of it. I'm going to put it in the description, and maybe we'll do a deep dive later on it. But I want to stay on topic of the TTC because there was another problem, not just the fact that the trams weren't really working, but the fact that some guests were getting this incredible experience on the monorail on the highway in the sky, and some of them were taking a parking lot tram on a road that was really unthemed. And so what Disney did was they said, let's do something quick. Let's create Topiary Lane. If you look at a map today of the TTC, Topiary Lane still exists, although it's really just a shell of itself. It connected the Transportation and Ticket Center right up kind of in the top right corner all the way to World Drive. And the reason it was called Topiary Lane is because Disney created these incredible topiaries, like the ones you see at Flower and Garden Festival, for guests to enjoy. They had Mary Poppins, they had a giraffe, they had elephants, and they had so much more. And this really helped guests transition from the TTC to the magic of the Magic Kingdom. Now, this entire problem kind of sorted itself out based on that large purchase order for 2 huge ferry boats I mentioned. By July of 1972, the Magic Kingdom 1 and the Magic Kingdom 2 arrived. These could carry 600 guests each, and that problem was sort of solved. In 1976, the Kingdom Queen ferry joined, and then those boats were all later renamed. Magic Kingdom 1 became the Admiral Joe Fowler, the Magic Kingdom 2 became the Richard F. Irvine, and the Kingdom Queen became the General Joe Potter, which we covered in our Mosquitoes deep dive last week. And so the TTC eliminated that tram service and those temporary motorboat service, and they really just had the monorail and the ferry running from the TTC to Magic Kingdom. But then came a critical decision for Disney.
Epcot's transportation lobby. Although out of sight to hotel guests, This transportation terminal will play a key role in the City of Tomorrow's ability to meet the needs of both visitor and resident. Two separate but interconnecting transit systems will move people into and out of Epcot in speed, safety, and comfort through this central terminal. Both are electrically powered. The high-speed monorail for rapid transit over longer distances, and a concept new to the American city for shorter travel distances, the Wedway People Mover.
Because Epcot was part of phase 2, and as they were working on it, they needed to decide what would they do about parking. They always knew they wanted a monorail running all the way north-south on Disney property, but did they want to add a parking lot too at Epcot, or did they want to use this centralized transportation and ticket center that they had built that was really intended to function as parking for the entire resort? Well, as they were developing Epcot in the 1970s and kind of shifting it from Walt's original vision to that theme park space, they realized this was not going to work. They had to have a parking lot there, but they did stick with a portion of the original vision, and they added that Epcot monorail. It's interesting because honestly, the Epcot monorail is not the most trafficked line. There's not that many people who use it. Many of the resort guests do, but not that many other people. It was a huge investment, one they would never make today, but one they did at that time to stay true to Walt's vision. And that was all confirmed by the 1979 Disney shareholder report, where they said, "Today, with enormous enthusiasm and excitement, we are announcing the Epcot Center, a vast new project for public interface with the concepts of tomorrow, will open in October 1st of 1982. The new project will be located just 2 miles from the Contemporary Resort Hotel and will be linked to the present Vacation Kingdom by monorail." And so while that was true, it was linked by monorail, and the guests at the Contemporary and at the Polynesian Resort could take the monorail from their resort, transferring at the TTC, to Epcot. Almost everyone else would just drive directly to Epcot and park in the brand new parking lots. So maybe not what they originally planned, but luckily they were smart enough to know that this just would not be efficient enough to transfer all the guests who are going there. But the TTC also served another purpose that we haven't even begun to touch on, and one that is actually relatively abandoned today. And that was the Disney bus system. So in the very beginning days of the Magic Kingdom, you know that there was the Polynesian, the Contemporary, and the Fort Wilderness Campground. If you've watched the deep dive on the Lost Monorail resorts, you know that Disney also planned to build a couple of others. The Asian resort, where the Grand Floridian is today, that was supposed to open in the 1970s. They were going to build a Venetian resort on an unused parcel of land between the Contemporary and the TTC. That was supposed to open in the 1970s. And the Persian resort, which was going to be north of the Contemporary, kind of near Space Mountain, that was also supposed to open in the 1970s. But with the oil embargo and all sorts of other problems, Disney completely scrapped all of these, and instead they built the Gulf Resort, and that would open as the third resort on Disney property in the early 1970s. They also created other things like the Lake Buena Vista Shopping Village. This is now what Downtown Disney or Disney Springs is, just as another place for guests to be entertained. And they did add a couple of other resorts eventually, but these were kind of the core ones for a while, and they had buses that would run from Magic Kingdom to the resort, but they didn't actually run to Magic Kingdom. The plan was never for anyone to be dropped off at Magic Kingdom. They actually were dropped off at the TTC. The TTC had a huge bus station, just like what's at Magic Kingdom today. So this bus loop would allow buses to drop off here, and then guests, just like everyone else who was parking, would take the monorail or the ferry. But in the 1980s, a major shift happened for the Walt Disney World Company when Michael Eisner became the CEO. And one of the things that he did was introduce a whole bunch of new resorts to Walt Disney World property. Now there were tons of buses going to the TTC. And so in the late 1980s, Disney decided to actually build a bus loop adjacent to Magic Kingdom. That way resort guests could just be dropped off straight at the park and didn't have to experience the TTC. Imagineers were horrified, ones who had worked on this amazing kind of aquatic red carpet that would roll out for guests. They were taking away this vision, but actually resort guests were getting a huge benefit because the TTC would take a lot of time. And when they moved those buses up to Magic Kingdom, that old bus loop became mostly abandoned. Granted, today it's still used for some buses like I think Swan and Dolphin and Shades of Green, and also just like school trips with large buses who drop off there, but it does not have that same feel that it had in the 70s and 80s. And that's not the only thing at the Transportation and Ticket Center that is kind of left abandoned today, because right when you enter the TTC, there are a ton of old ticket booths. The other half of the Transportation and Ticket Center are tickets, and we haven't touched on that. And these ticket booths were where everyone would buy their tickets. And people still do buy tickets day of, but much, much less, because many people coming to the Disney Resort buy their tickets online now. And if you haven't been to Disney in a while, you should buy your tickets online. You should buy them in advance. That way you can book everything you need. There are still people who use the ticket booths, don't get me wrong, but most people buy them online. And so this old ticket booth area, which used to have a ton of people waiting in line to buy tickets, is now kind of unused. On either side of the ticket booth area, let's talk about the right side first, we have Mickey's Gift Station, the TTC gift shop, which permanently closed in 2019 when Disney reworked the security and said it will never reopen. So no gift shop, there's still some bathrooms over there. On the other side of the ticket booths, we're going to see something called the Westgate building. This is where the ferry and the monorail, the cast members take their breaks. It's actually 2 stories apparently, and this is also where they'll clock in for work. And interestingly enough, there's actually apparently a tunnel that runs underground under the ticket booths from the Westgate building to Mickey's Gift Station. Irrelevant to this video, but I just thought that was really cool, and I just learned that. And so today, the TTC, the actual core area, is kind of a shell of itself. And we should talk about one other thing that's also really important, which is the actual parking lots. Because the Magic Kingdom parking lot, the TTC, is massive, maybe even oversized, dare I say, because it was meant to accommodate so many guests going to other locations. So the parking lots that they had originally were split into 2 sections. The first were based on kind of the Fab Five: Chip and Dale, Pluto, Daisy, Minnie, Goofy, and Donald. Sorry, no Mickey. The other side had Sleepy, Dopey, Happy, Grumpy, Sneezy, and Bashful, the 7 dwarves, or the 6 dwarves. I always think it's a cool fact that Imagineers didn't create a dock parking lot because they didn't want people to get confused with a dock, the dwarf parking lot, versus the ferry docks. Of course, in 2011, those parking lot names changed. They created the Heroes and Villains section, and that really was an attempt by Disney to make it more clear to guests where they were going because it was very confusing of which side to go. And so all of the 7 Dwarfs parking lots were renamed. They created the Villains parking lots and renamed a bunch of the other ones. More recently, they also adjusted the security at the TTC. They reworked it really just to make it a little bit easier for guests to get from point A to point B because after all, that is the goal. But the TTC today just has some big problems. And when I put my civil engineering hat back on, I remember something that I learned in the really early days of when I was either in college or just starting my career. And it was said by an older gentleman who had been an engineer for like 50 years. And he said, the thing about transportation is that no one wants to use it, but everyone has to use it. And as an example for that, I'll say, you don't want to get in your car to drive to visit your friend. Not enjoyable to get in your car to do that. But you do want to visit your friends. So you'll get in your car and you'll drive through the roads to get to them because it's important. You don't want to be doing it, but you have to be doing it. And so as engineers, our real goal is to make this as enjoyable of an experience as possible, minimizing the traffic and the disruptions and just making it easy to use this system. But generally, you're not going to be having like a fun time on transportation. Of course, this is going directly against what Imagineers wanted, and they wanted guests to be having a super fun time on the monorail. And the monorail still is really cool, and the ferry is as well. But I think many people think of the TTC as just kind of an inconvenience. By the time you park your car, you wait for a tram, you get to the front of the trams, you go through security, you pick the monorail or the ferry, you wait for those, you finally get to Magic Kingdom. It can take like a half hour or more. And then even worse, when you're actually leaving Magic Kingdom, the lines for the monorail, the lines for the ferry, they could just get out of control that Disney sometimes has to run a bus loop from the buses to the TTC just to kind of add enough capacity for guests. So yes, the TTC is an inconvenience, and it certainly isn't what Imagineers wanted it to be at the time, which was basically another attraction. And one of the main reasons is that is just because of the capacity of the parks. It really has changed. And I just think also the way that we do Disney now is different than people did in the past. Now it's like rope dropping, go, 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 let's get through the parks. And back then it was a little bit more of like almost experiencing park. And so for that, this last bit of the deep dive is really just going to be me talking about what I think that they should do to the Transportation and Ticket Center, because for some reason I spent like a full day redesigning the TTC just to kind of see if I could. So I'm going to go through that now. And if, that's not your thing, scroll away, because that really was the deep dive. But now this is Mouselet 2's attempt to fix the TTC, because if I'm going to complain about it, I'm going to see if I can do it better. So the first thing I'm going to do at the TTC today is kind of look at the different pedestrian desire lines. Where are people trying to go? They come off of the trams. They're going to the ferry over to the left, really tucked away. They're going to the monorail. There's these big crossing movements. Same thing when they're leaving. They're all being funneled through the little areas between all the ticket booths, which are not even needed anymore. The second thing I'm looking at is some of the other unused things. The Westgate building, which is used for cast members, I think is important, and we're going to locate that somewhere important. But I do think I want it a little bit out of the way of the regular guests. And also the Mickey's Gift Station. I mean, it's closed, it's never reopening. So what can we do with that space? So as I wipe the slate clean and I look at the pedestrian desire lines, I kind of have another goal. And that is to make sure that the ferry is as visible and prominent as the monorail. Because today, although the monorail might be more fun and it might have been the intent to be the primary mode of transportation, it has to be used equally to the ferry. There's so many people, they need to pick those options equally. And so I'm going to reorient a little bit the TTC, shifting it a little bit to the side so when people enter, they see the ferry and the monorail as equal paths. Now, if I draw my pedestrian desire lines again, I can see that I actually have some hollow spaces here. And that's where I'll put some planters that actually will help funnel guests to and from their destination. This is a good spot to put signs, heroes, villains, ferry, monorail, making it a little bit more clear to guests, and also kind of creating a line in and of itself rather than having a horde of guests arrive at a place and then have to pinch down. They have to pinch down at some point, so they might as well do it in a little more natural way. Other things I'm doing at the TTC before we get into design elements, I'm moving security slightly south. They're gonna have a big awning area, organizing it however they want, but just making it a little bit more permanent. And I'm also eliminating all of the ticket booths because they're not needed. If someone needs to go buy a ticket, I'm gonna put a small information area over to the side by the bathrooms where the Mickey's gift station used to be. They can do everything they need here, guest services, whatever, or they can just head into Magic Kingdom if Disney prefers. But the last thing I did is design elements, because the TTC in the 1970s was actually nothing special. But that was a time that I think that like concrete, like sleek concrete kind of felt futuristic. Like at Epcot, it kind of maybe felt futuristic at the time. I don't know, it doesn't anymore. But then in the 1990s, it was more of just like a quick refresh. They didn't overhaul it. And so now it just looks dated, like the 80s meet the 90s in a really unattractive way. So the first thing I'm gonna do is just bring some more greenery and life into it. Adding a couple of trees, adding those bigger planters, it's just gonna make it feel like a little bit nicer. I'm also in the center going to put one of the old Walt Disney World survey markers there. I think this could be really cool because they're all over property. It kind of ties the TTC back to its roots, which is the fact that it wasn't supposed to exist and only did because of that site survey. So I put that in the middle, and I also made the pavement a giant hidden Mickey because there aren't enough giant hidden Mickeys on property anymore. I love a giant hidden Mickey. What can I say? I'm also going to make that ferry area a little bit more distinctive. I'm going to put some blue pavement, maybe a fountain, bringing the water element over to the ferry, making the ferry more desirable. I love the ferry, but I feel like most people prefer the monorail. And speaking of the monorail, the roofs of those buildings, I'm going to put these sleek roofs that are used in kind of modern transportation today, just to kind of bring a little bit more of that futuristic element. The highway in the sky, the monorail should feel futuristic because the world does not have enough monorails. It is sad to say that it's still a futuristic piece of technology, so let's make it feel like that. And so my final plan here, I think, just refreshes the TTC in a way that could make it so much better. It makes it a little bit more efficient, but of course the pain of having to go there will still always exist. We might as well make the space as enjoyable as possible and also as efficient as possible. And that is all I have for you today on the deep dive of the TTC. Thank you for watching. Be sure to subscribe because every Monday we post all of these incredible deep dives, and I will see you next week. Bye.